Good evening all and welcome back to Whispers at Night. We've all been there. The late night run to that one store that never closes. The lights are a little too bright, the aisles a little too empty, and the silence is broken only by the hum of the freezers. But you're not alone. You never were. Millions of people walk through the automatic doors of Walmart every single day, believing it's just a store. But for an unlucky few, it became a stage for their worst nightmares. They discovered that in a place that big, there are too many corners for things to hide, and too many cameras that see what the human eye misses. These stories aren't legends. They're confessions from the night shift and chilling warnings from shoppers who stayed too long after dark. They tell of encounters with people who aren't people, of whispers that follow you from aisle to aisle, and of the paralyzing fear that comes when you realize the person watching you isn't looking for a bargain. If you're new to the channel, subscribe to Whispers at Night for true horror that proves the most terrifying things happen right in plain sight. Ring that notification bell so you're the first to know when the darkness calls. Now, let's listen to the stories from behind the shelves, where the last thing you'll find is a good night's sleep. Retirement is supposed to be an erasure of the past, a clean slate. For me, it's mostly been that. A peaceful rhythm of sunrises over the lake, the scent of freshly cut grass, and the joyous chaos of my grandchildren treating my backyard as their personal kingdom. Yet the past is stubborn. It clings to certain places, embedding itself in brick and mortar. And every time my car cruises past the Grand Prix grocery on Main Street in Westmore, the quiet present dissolves. I'm 22 again. The polyester of my new uniform scratching at my neck, and the badge on my chest feels like 100-pound weight. It was in that building, amidst the aisles of cereal and produce, that I learned the most unforgiving lesson of my life in law enforcement, a lesson that etched itself onto my soul. The summer of 2002 was thick with humidity and my own unseasoned ambition. I was a rookie, fresh from the academy, my head filled with a simplistic, Hollywood-fueled vision of police work. I saw the world as a chessboard of good versus evil, a series of straightforward problems that could be solved with a firm voice and the authority of the badge. I was convinced my days would be spent chasing getaway cars and ticketing illegally parked sedans. I had yet to learn that reality is a tangled, messy affair, painted not in black and white, but in infinite, heartbreaking shades of gray. The Grand Prix was the town's unofficial living room. Its parking lot hummed with the weekend bustle of family vehicles, and just inside its sliding doors, the cheerful cacophony of vintage arcade machines provided a constant soundtrack. It was a place of mundane domestic dramas, spouses debating the merits of different pasta sauces, seniors lingering by the registers to gossip with cashiers they'd known since childhood. Presiding over this domain was Olivia Chen, the store's manager. A woman in her late 30s, who had climbed the ladder from bagging groceries to running the whole operation. She moved with an efficiency that bordered on intimidating. Her gaze missed nothing. There was a quiet respect for her among the staff, tinged with a healthy dose of fear. Olivia didn't suffer fools. But if you were in trouble, she was an immovable ally. And then there was Marco Thompson, a name known throughout that side of Westmore. He was a tall man in his early 40s, though he carried himself as if he were much older, his shoulders perpetually slumped as if bearing an invisible, crushing burden. A frayed, heavy coat was his uniform, an absurd choice in the blistering 90-degree heat. Marco's mind was a fractured landscape, diagnosed years earlier as paranoid schizophrenia. He wasn't a man with malice in his heart, despite the fearful whispers that followed him. He was ill, a casualty who had tumbled through every crack in our community's threadbare social safety net. My first official encounter with him was a dispatch call to that very Grand Prix. The report was vague, a man causing a disturbance in the electronics aisle. I arrived braced for a fight, my training cycling through my mind. What I found was Marco, cornered by Olivia, his voice a frantic torrent of words about secret messages being transmitted to him through the television screens. Olivia's expression was a mask of controlled frustration, not fear. Her concern was for her customers, who were giving the aisle a wide berth. I found my voice, pitching it low and steady, a lifeline of calm in his storm of paranoia. "Marco," I said, "how about we step outside for a minute? Get some fresh air." The tension in his shoulders eased. He complied without a fight. As we stood in the sticky evening air, I called his sister. She arrived 20 minutes later, her car rattling into the parking lot, her face etched with a familiar mix of shame and exhaustion. She explained he'd gone off his medication again and promised, with a weary sigh, to make sure he took it. In my youthful optimism, I accepted that as a resolution, a neat closing of the file. But the calls kept coming. In the months that followed, Marco became an unfortunate staple of my patrol shifts. The calls were always the same, the location a constant. I'd find him walking the length of the store, his whispers bouncing off the linoleum floors. Sometimes he would stand sentry at the entrance, arms outstretched, a human barricade preventing shoppers from coming or going. One afternoon, he trailed a small child through the store, convinced the boy was a government operative sent to watch him. A grim pattern emerged, a few weeks of relative lucidity, followed by a steep, frightening decline. His sister was drowning, trying to manage her own family while simultaneously being the sole anchor for her brother. The mental health system was a ghost, a series of unreturned phone calls in underfunded departments. It was a tragedy I was beginning to see on a loop throughout the city. Olivia was on the front lines of this slow-motion disaster. For reasons lost in the labyrinth of his illness, Marco had zeroed in on her. He became convinced she was the keeper of some great secret, hidden files, illicit funds, the key to the conspiracies that plagued him. Every time I responded, she would be there, resolute but with new lines of fatigue etched around her eyes. One evening, after I had led Marco out once more, I found her leaning against a counter and asked if she was ever afraid. She looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Of Marco? I don't think he's in control of what he's doing," she said, shaking her head. "But I'm afraid of the day when just talking to him stops being enough." Her words hung in the air between us. I had no answer. I was still clinging to the Academy's gospel that patience and de-escalation were foolproof, and for a while they were. But I began to see her locking her office door earlier, her eyes darting to the entrance every time the bell chimed. Fear is an insidious thing. It seeps into your bones and changes you from the inside out. I felt a knot of unease tighten in my own gut, but I pushed it down. No one had been hurt. I told myself that was a victory. Still, a cold dread began to coil in my stomach whenever I saw the familiar shape of Marco's coat at the end of an aisle. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a frantic, hunted look. His gaze never settled, always darting, searching for threats that weren't there. Hindsight is a cruel thing. I see now that I should have been a louder advocate, filed more detailed reports, demanded action from the agencies meant to help him. But I was a rookie. I saw my job in terms of individual calls, not as a piece of a larger, failing puzzle. My education was about to be completed. It came on a suffocating September night, as the clock ticked toward 10. The store was winding down, populated only by a handful of stragglers and the closing crew. I was only a few blocks away when the radio crackled to life. Reports of a disturbance at the Grand Prix. Subject may be armed. My blood ran cold. By the time my tires screeched into the lot, Marco was already inside. He moved with a purpose I had never seen, his lumpy coat hiding something. His voice, raw and desperate, echoed Olivia's name. Carts were abandoned mid-aisle as the last few shoppers scrambled for the exit. Olivia had been showing a teenage stalker the closing procedures. Her training kicked in, and she moved to place her body between the boy and the approaching threat. "Marco, that's enough. Put it down," she commanded, her voice firm but trembling. Then I saw it, the glint of metal as he pulled a long, slender knife from his coat. My world narrowed to a single point. I moved in, my service, weapon in my hand. "Marco, drop the knife, now!" He stopped for a single, infinite second. His whole body vibrated with a terrible energy. His mouth worked, but no words came out, as if some rational part of him was fighting for control. I held my breath, pleading with whatever God was listening that he would hear me, that my voice could pull him back from the brink. Then, a sound tore from his throat, a sound of pure agony, and he lunged, not at me, at Olivia. The next moments are a series of brutal, indelible snapshots burned into my brain. The deafening explosion of my firearm in the enclosed space, the metallic clang of the knife hitting the tile, the heavy, final thud of Marco's body falling into a display of potato chip bags, Olivia's piercing scream, and the young stalker, pale and motionless, his eyes wide with a horror he would never unseen. It was finished in a heartbeat, but it has never ended. Marco was gone before the medics could get there. In the aftermath, I sat on the curb outside, the acrid smell of gunpowder clinging to my uniform, my head buried in my hands. My training officer arrived and squeezed my shoulder, murmuring the standard lines, that I did what was necessary, that I saved her life. His words were meaningless noise against the roar in my head. They couldn't silence the image of Marco on the floor, his eyes fixed on the fluorescent lights above, his mouth still agape as if he had one last thing to plead. For months, the same questions haunted my sleep. Did I have another second? Could another word have made a difference? The department ruled it a justifiable shooting. The review board cleared my name. But regulations and protocols don't have to carry the weight of a life taken. I did. Olivia returned to the Grand Prix, but the woman who walked those aisles was a shadow of her former self. She started carrying pepper spray, and her gaze was never still, always scanning, always watching. Quiet confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle armor. Trauma isn't always a visible wound. The teenage stalker found another job within a few weeks. He was just a kid, and he'd been forced to witness the violent end of a man's life. I didn't blame him for running. That night reshaped me. It followed me into every domestic dispute, every welfare check, every tense encounter for the rest of my career. Every person I met who was in the throes of a crisis wore Marco's face. It was then I understood that the core of police work wasn't about heroes and villains. It was about standing at the intersection of broken systems and broken people, and knowing that sometimes you'd be forced into a choice with no good outcome. The years rolled on. I earned promotions, mentored new officers, and eventually put in my papers. But the ghost of that night in 2002 never fully receded. Now, when I speak to a room full of fresh-faced recruits, I don't tell them war stories to scare them. I tell them about Marco. I give them the unvarnished truth I wish someone had given me, that our work exists in the gray spaces. It's about people battling illnesses we can't see, families buckling under impossible weight, and institutions that are failing the very people they're meant to serve. And it's about the irreversible consequences of split-second decisions that will follow you home. Even today, decades later, when I drive by the Grand Prix, I don't see the renovated facade or the bustling parking lot. My mind strips it all away. I see Marco, lost in his own personal hell, shrouded in that heavy coat. I see Olivia, brave and terrified. And I see myself, a young man with a gun in his shaking hand, who was forced to learn that some tragedies aren't born from evil. They are born from neglect. They grow in the silence that surrounds mental illness, and they culminate in moments of crisis where everyone, absolutely everyone, loses. That is the lesson. Compassion isn't a liability, it's a necessity. Because the more we turn away from those who are falling, the more certain it is that we will one day be forced to confront them when they finally hit the ground. By 29, I felt like I'd already gone 12 rounds with life and lost everyone on points. The year was 2011, and the ghost of my former life, a modest contracting business I'd built with my own two hands, haunted me. It had never been much, just a beat-up work van, a rotating crew for the heavy lifting, and the quiet pride of doing honest work. We were the guys who patched up leaky roofs, put up backyard sheds, and gave kitchens a facelift. It was a life of sawdust and sweat, but it was a life I owned. Then the recession hit like a tidal wave, and my little business was swept out to sea. Suddenly, new countertops were a luxury no one could afford when foreclosure was knocking at the door. The phone fell silent. The unpaid bills became a mountain on my desk, and in less than a year, I was financially ruined. My fiancée, Sarah, was picking up extra shifts at the diner, coming home smelling of grease and coffee, her feet swollen, while I became a permanent fixture on the sofa, marinating in failure and the shame of unopened mail. That's how I found myself applying for a position as an overnight stalker at the Lincoln Avenue MegaMart. I framed it as a stopgap measure, a tactical retreat to regroup before I could start rebuilding. But a temporary solution has a way of becoming a permanent reality. 4 months bled into 7, and soon I was approaching the 1-year mark of my supposed short-term gig. By day, MegaMart was a symphony of suburban chaos, a frantic blur of overflowing carts, shrieking toddlers, and managers barking orders. It was loud and stressful, but it was alive. The night shift, however, was a descent into another realm entirely. After the adjoining mall powered down at 9:30 and the corrugated steel security gate came crashing down, the store transformed. Emergency lighting cast the aisles in a dim spectral glow, turning rows of merchandise into towering, shadowed monoliths. In the profound silence, every incidental sound was amplified into something startling. The lonely squeal of a cartwheel from across the store, the sudden thud of a falling box, each one echoing like a percussive shock. I tried to drown it out, to escape into the world of my headphones while I mindlessly organized shelves, but a persistent, prickling sensation of being watched always lingered at the edge of my awareness. It was on a particularly cold November night, the kind where the chill seems to ride in on the draft from the automatic doors, that I first saw him. I was in the canned goods aisle, creating a perfect pyramid of corn, when a flicker of movement by the mall gate caught my eye. A man stood there, his hands wrapped around the cold steel bars, his gaze directed upward, past me, as if he were studying the acoustic tiles of the ceiling. His hair was a greasy curtain that obscured his features, and he was swallowed by a grimy denim jacket and worn-out cargo pants. He seemed utterly oblivious to my presence, his entire focus consumed by whatever he saw above. Then, with a sudden, silent burst of energy, he began to shake the gate with a frightening violence. My voice was a dry rasp. "Sir, can I help you?" He offered no reply, just gave the gate one final jarring rattle before freezing into absolute stillness. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, his head slowly turned. His eyes found mine, and he held my gaze with an unnerving intensity, as if he were committing every detail of my face to memory. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he melted back into the unlit corridor of the mall. I remained motionless, a can of green beans feeling impossibly heavy in my hand, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My rational mind tried to supply an explanation. He was just a transient seeking shelter from the cold, but the feeling of deep, instinctual wrongness wouldn't subside. The thought of calling mall security crossed my mind, but I could already hear my manager's perpetually annoyed voice. "Don't call me unless the building is on fire, Greg. You handle your own section." So, I did what I had learned to do. I swallowed my fear and returned to my work. That, however, was merely the prelude. An hour or so later, while stocking the frozen food aisle, the whisper of the front entrance doors sliding open made me look up. I expected a customer on a late-night ice cream run. It was him, the same gaunt frame, the same cargo pants, but the denim jacket had vanished. He was now wearing a simple gray t-shirt that was stretched taut over his thin chest. He advanced slowly past the rows of shopping carts, and this time, there was no mistaking his focus. His eyes were locked on me, and then he smiled. It wasn't a human expression of warmth or greeting. It was a slow, deliberate, and utterly grotesque twisting of his lips, a predator's grin that turned the blood in my veins to ice. A primal wave of terror washed over me. Every instinct screamed for flight. I dropped the bag of frozen peas I was holding and bolted for the employee lounge, slamming the solid door shut behind me and fumbling with the lock. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and stabbed at my manager's number. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. I tried again, the result the same. I found myself whispering into the dead air, as if the man could hear me through the concrete walls. "Pick up, please, just pick up." Total silence. I huddled in the gloom of the break room, straining to hear anything. A long moment passed, And then I heard it. The soft hiss of the automatic doors opening and then closing. And then only the ceaseless, indifferent hum of the freezers. I stayed locked in that room for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes before I dared to creep out. The store was as I had left it, silent, still, and empty. My abandoned cart stood as a lonely sentinel. The bag of peas was beginning to thaw on the linoleum floor, but the man was gone. That night, sleep was a stranger. Every time I drifted off, that hideous, knowing grin flashed behind my eyelids. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, I tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But I couldn't shake the memory. I had to know. When my manager arrived, I demanded we review the security tapes. "Another one of your stories, Greg?" He sighed, exasperated. But I wouldn't let it go. Reluctantly, he pulled up the footage, and there he was, at 9:30, just as I'd seen him. Long hair, denim jacket, hands on the gate, staring at the ceiling before shaking the bars like a caged animal. "Some lunatic," my manager grumbled. "Wait," I insisted. We fast-forwarded. An hour later, the main entrance doors slid open. The same figure entered, now stripped of his jacket, clad in the gray t-shirt. As he turned toward my aisle, the camera captured the grin that spread across his face. Even my cynical manager recoiled from the screen. "Okay," he breathed, snapping the laptop shut. "That's unsettling." Unsettling didn't begin to cover it. The incident shattered my already frayed nerves. Work became an exercise in controlled paranoia. The slightest noise made me spin around. The sound of distant footsteps had me peering down the long, empty aisles. When I tried to explain it to my coworkers, they just laughed. "You're working too hard, man. You seriously need a vacation." Perhaps they were right. I was a nocturnal creature by necessity, disconnected from a normal life, barely seeing Sarah. But I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that what I had seen was real. That smile was not random. It was a message. I soldiered on for a few more weeks, but the job had become unbearable. The bills were still relentless, but my dread was stronger. I dreaded the walk from my car, dreaded the moment the steel gate came down, and dreaded the long, silent hours spent waiting. He never returned, not in any way I could see, but his presence was a permanent stain on that place. The fear was a constant companion. A month after the incident, I handed in my notice. I gave Sarah a sanitized version of the truth, the terrible hours, the low pay, the soul-crushing nature of the work. She understood, but I never told her the real reason. I couldn't spend another night in that building, waiting for that man to step out of the shadows. Even now, when I find myself driving down Lincoln Avenue at night, my eyes are drawn to the faint glow of the MegaMart entrance, and I always feel a cold knot in my stomach, wondering if he is still wandering those darkened corridors, rattling gates, and searching for the next person to share his smile with. At 42, my body had become a roadmap of my career. Every mile logged in the patrol car was etched into the permanent ache in my lower back, and 2 decades of gas station cuisine had tied my stomach into a permanent knot. The job of a state trooper on the highway patrol was a relentless grind, and that particular evening in May of 2019 was a masterclass in chaos. The north side of Springfield had thrown everything it had at me. A chain reaction collision that turned the interstate into a parking lot. A high-speed pursuit that devolved into a foot chase through a residential neighborhood, and a stalled semi-truck that bottlenecked traffic for miles. It was a 12-hour shift that felt like a lifetime. When the garage door finally rumbled shut behind me, I slumped forward, letting my forehead come to rest on the cool plastic of the steering wheel. The silence of my driveway was a welcome reprieve. Just as I was summoning the energy to unbuckle, my phone buzzed. It was my wife, Sarah. "Josh," she began, her voice already apologetic. "I'm so sorry, but we're completely out of milk and bread. Do you think you could possibly swing by the fresh market?" A deep sigh escaped me. My entire being yearned for the embrace of my worn leather recliner and the hiss of a cold soda can. but arguing with Sarah after a shift like this was a battle I had no energy for. On my way, I conceded, my voice flat with exhaustion. I backed the cruiser out and pointed it toward Route 45. The fresh market was familiar territory. Over the years, I'd worked everything from minor traffic accidents in its parking lot to chasing down shoplifters who tried to make a run for it. For everyone else, it was a grocery store. For me, it was just another pin on a map where things went wrong. A soft, persistent drizzle was slicking the asphalt as I pulled into a spot around 10:30 p.m. The parking lot was sparsely populated, its bright overhead lights creating shimmering, distorted reflections on the wet ground. Inside, I moved with the efficiency of a man on a mission, offering a brief nod to the night shift employees who looked as drained as I felt. I grabbed the requested items, paid, and headed back out. My uniform was still on, my sidearm still holstered at my hip. The transition from trooper to husband wasn't a switch you could just flip. It was as I was pushing the cart toward my car that my eyes landed on them. Huddled under the buzzing glow of a faulty lamp at the far edge of the lot were 4 young men, draped over the hood and tailgate of a dented pickup truck. The acrid scent of marijuana, not tobacco, drifted on the damp air. One of them, with a theatrical laugh, launched an empty beer bottle that exploded against the pavement. Another shouted a string of obscenities at an elderly couple making their way to their car. Every rational part of my brain told me to get in my cruiser and drive away. I was off the clock. This wasn't my fight. But the uniform has a weight that extends beyond the shift. I altered my course and walked toward them, instinctively pulling my badge from my belt. "All right, fellas," I started, my tone even but firm. "Time to pack it up, clean up your mess and find somewhere else to be." A kid with a defiant smirk scoffed. "Relax, man. We're just hanging out." From another came a mumbled comment, just loud enough to be an intentional insult. "Cop thinks he runs the whole damn city." I ignored it. "You're done hanging out here. Now." For a moment, it seemed like they might comply. Then the tallest of the group reached into the truck bed. Before my brain could even register the movement as a threat, a baseball bat was in his hands. He swung it with vicious force, connecting squarely with my ribs. A starburst of white-hot pain erupted in my side, stealing my breath and sending me staggering backward. My hand flew to my holster, but by the time I had my weapon drawn, they were already piling into the cab of the truck. Tires screamed in protest against the wet pavement, and they were gone, leaving me standing in the rain, gasping for air, the carton of milk and loaf of bread lying ruptured at my feet. On duty or off, the reminder was brutal. Trouble doesn't check your schedule. At the emergency room, after a series of prods and x-rays, the doctor confirmed nothing was broken. "Just a severe contusion," he announced. "It's going to hurt for a while." Sarah arrived shortly after, her face a storm of worry and exasperation. "You should have just kept walking, Josh," she said, her voice tight. "I couldn't," I rasped. "They were harassing people." "You're not paid to be a hero when you're buying groceries," she countered. "You can't fix every problem you see." I promised her I would take it easy, that I was coming straight home. But as I guided my cruiser back onto the interstate, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers mimicking the throbbing in my side, a flicker of light on the shoulder ahead caught my attention. Hazard lights, blinking in the darkness. It was the pickup. Same dented fender, same scratched bumper. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the pain. I pulled my vehicle onto the shoulder behind it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3401, I said into the radio, my voice sharp. "I have a visual on a suspicious vehicle, eastbound interstate. Vehicle matches the description from an earlier assault. I'm requesting immediate backup. I see no movement from the occupants. Driver's side window is down." I exited my cruiser, my movements deliberate, flashlight cutting a path through the rainy darkness, my right hand resting on my sidearm. As I approached the cab and angled my light inside, my blood ran cold. There on the passenger seat were 2 spent shell casings gleaming in the beam. The T-10 ruck was empty. "Dispatch," I updated, my voice low and controlled. "Vehicle appears to be abandoned. I have 2 shell casings in plain view. Expedite backup. That's when I heard it. A distinct sound from the darkness beyond the guardrail. The soft, heavy tread of footsteps on the wet grass and weeds that lined the tree line. "State police!" I yelled, my voice swallowed by the vast, empty highway. "Identify yourself!" The only answer was the rustling of foliage. Then came the retort, not of a voice, but of gunfire. 3 rapid cracks exploded from the darkness. Instinct took over. I dove behind the relative cover of the pickup as bullets punched through the rear windshield, showering me with a cascade of tempered glass. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" I yelled into the radio. "I am taking fire from the tree line. I need backup now." The next few minutes were an eternity. The rain intensified, plastering my uniform to my skin and mixing with the tiny cubes of glass on my shoulders. Every breath was a fresh wave of agony from my side. I remained crouched, pistol aimed at the black wall of trees, every nerve ending screaming. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was more menacing than the gunfire. I held my position, knowing that a lack of noise didn't mean a lack of threat. The distant wail of sirens grew steadily louder, a sound that was both a relief and a signal that this was far from over. The first responding unit skidded to a stop, its emergency lights painting the scene in frantic strobes of red and blue. 2 troopers emerged, rifles at the ready. "Josh, what's your status?" one shouted. "Behind the suspect's vehicle," I called back. "Took 3 rounds from the woods to my east." They began a cautious advance, their powerful flashlights sweeping the area as more cruisers arrived, turning the lonely stretch of highway into a hive of activity. Then, the impossible happened. The pickup truck's engine roared to life. With a screech of tortured rubber, it lurched forward, fishtailing wildly on the slick road before straightening out and rocketing down the interstate. "He's mobile. Suspect vehicle is mobile," I shouted, staying low. Several units immediately gave chase, their sirens rising to a fever pitch as they disappeared into the rain-soaked night. I stayed put, leaning heavily against my cruiser, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving only the cold rain and the searing pain in my side. My gut screamed that this was all wrong. The shots hadn't come from the truck, they came from the woods. It was 10 minutes before the chase concluded and my backup returned. They had boxed in the pickup a few miles down the road. The driver, a terrified young man, was pulled from the vehicle, spitting curses. A handgun was recovered from the back seat, a caliber match for the casings on the seat. But the discovery that would haunt me was made by the crime scene unit. A thorough search of the woods from where the shots originated yielded nothing. Not a single casing. No discernible footprints in the mud. No sign of a second person. There was no physical evidence to support what I knew had happened. It was my word against the empty, silent woods. Later that night, as Sarah gently pressed an ice pack to my ribs, her hands were shaking. "You could have been killed out there, Josh," she whispered. "I know," was all I could manage. I didn't tell her the part that was now coiling in my own stomach. The chilling certainty that the person who tried to kill me was not the one in the jail cell. The official report was neat, tidy, and closed. 1 suspect in custody, 1 weapon off the street. Case pending. But I knew the truth was messier. The angles of the shots, the timing, the sheer impossibility of it all. It pointed to a ghost, a second shooter who had vanished without a trace. In the weeks that followed, a new level of vigilance became my constant companion. I found myself scanning parking lots, checking my rearview mirror, and feeling a jolt of unease at the sound of footsteps behind me. Sarah noticed I was quieter, more on edge. She was right. Some nights, I'd lie awake and hear the phantom sounds of that night, the crack of gunfire, and the rustle of unseen movement in the brush. The job had taught me that danger is an opportunist. It doesn't wait for an invitation. It can be a group of kids with a bat, or it can be a shadowy figure in the woods. It's arbitrary and merciless. You can follow your training, do everything by the book, and still find yourself a hair's breadth from the end. But it also taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the will to act in spite of it. Even when you're tired, even when you're hurt, even when the threat is a nameless shadow in the rain, we don't get to decide when trouble finds us. We only get to decide how we stand our ground and how we live with the ghosts it leaves behind. There are certain destinies you never imagine for yourself. At 32, I had pictured a life built on solid foundations, a career measured in concrete and timber, not in the lonely looping patrols of a third-shift security guard. My previous life, the one where I was a construction foreman, felt like a distant country I'd been exiled from. The work had been bone-deep tiring, but it was honest, and the paychecks had kept the lights on and my wife, Maria, smiling. When the housing market imploded, it took my job, my pride, and my sense of self along with it. So there I was, a man who once commanded crews, now a ghost haunting the sprawling parking lot of a MegaMart in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Maria was holding our world together with part-time work at a daycare, and our 5-year-old son still looked at me with an unblemished adoration I felt I no longer deserved. Defeat was a luxury I couldn't afford. The security gig was an act of pure desperation, a role created by the store after a spate of minor vandalism. I was the solution to graffiti, a human scarecrow for a concrete wilderness. The reality of the job was a suffocating brand of boredom. My nights were spent in a rattling electric cart, a glorified golf cart that vibrated with a tooth-loosening intensity. My primary duties involved scattering clusters of bored teenagers using the loading dock as their personal lounge or steering the occasional drunkard away from the automatic doors at 2 a.m. An hourly walkthrough of the store was my only reprieve from the circling. I'd navigate the cavernous, silent aisles, exchanging weary nods with the overnight stalkers who moved like phantoms among their pallets and boxes. The wage was just enough to keep our heads above water, but the cost was steep. I was operating on a permanent sleep deficit, a walking zombie fueled by caffeine and sheer will. Martia, Aya and I began to communicate in clipped sentences, the unspoken tension, a third presence in our small home. She needed a husband, our son needed a father, and I was just a tired man who smelled of stale coffee and cold vinyl. That winter of 2013 was a brutal one. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, erasing the world and transforming the parking lot into an Arctic expanse, a landscape of buried cars and howling wind under the sickly orange glare of the floodlights. It was in this sterile white world that the fabric of my reality began to fray. The first tear was almost unnoticeable. It was a little after 3 a.m. when a bank of lights in the outdoor gardening section, long since closed for the season, flickered to life. The area was secured, the gates padlocked. No one should have been there. Gripping my heavy-duty flashlight, I went to investigate. The silence inside was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the frozen concrete. "Hello?" The word was swallowed by the cavernous space. I saw nothing, but as I clicked off my flashlight, for a split second, I perceived a shape by the switch panel, a tall, slender silhouette against the ambient light. A man. My heart seized. I snapped the beam back on, and there was nothing but empty space and stacked bags of potting soil. Exhaustion, I told myself. A mind deprived of sleep is a fertile ground for mirages. And yet, I found myself holding the flashlight a little tighter that night, as if its beam could burn away the shadows that were beginning to gather at the edges of my vision. In the week that followed, the anomalies became more frequent, more insistent. Lights would bloom in deserted departments. I'd catch the phantom sound of footsteps on the polished linoleum, always seeming to come from the next aisle over. Once, as I passed the toy section, a sound pricked the silence, the unmistakable silvery chime of a child's laughter, lasting no more than a second. The aisle was a graveyard of plastic and cardboard. I breathed not a word of this to anyone. To the stalkers, I was already a symbol of a life gone off course. Admitting I was hearing things would have made me a cautionary tale, a punchline. I buried the fear, attributing each strange event to my depleted state. "This is what happens when you don't sleep," I'd mutter, a mantra against the encroaching dread. The most insidious part was the persistent feeling of being followed. It was a cold pressure on the back of my neck, the sensation of air being displaced just behind me. The long, gleaming aisles were like funhouse mirrors, my own reflection stretching and warping. It was easy to believe another shape was moving in tandem with my own. Time and again, I would whip around, my heart hammering against my ribs, only to be confronted by my own distorted image in the polished floor. Maria saw the toll it was taking. She'd ask me why I flinched at her touch, why my eyes were always scanning the corners of our own home. I offered her a lie that was close to the truth, telling her the sheer monotony of the job was making me lose my mind. She tried to smile, but her eyes held a deep, lingering worry. One night, my routine took me past the employee restrooms tucked away near the rear storage bays. I pushed the door open and froze on the threshold. From within the empty room came the distinct hydraulic whoosh of a flushing toilet. That in itself was not unusual, except these were modern Mochio and activated units. "Anybody in here?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy. Only the hum of the ventilation system answered. I systematically checked every stall. All were empty. I should have backed out, logged it as a faulty sensor, and continued my patrol. Instead, a stubborn, foolish part of me decided to stay, to sit in one of the stalls and prove to myself that the building was just a building, and my fear was my own creation. I sat, scrolling through my phone, the silence pressing in. A few minutes crawled by. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knocking on the shared wall of the stall beside me. A glacial coldness crept up my spine. I leaned down, my cheek almost touching the grimy tile, and peered into the gap below the partition. A pair of black work shoes stood there, planted firmly on the floor, facing my stall. They were perfectly still. I held my breath, my world shrinking to the sight of those two leather shoes. Then, defying all logic and instinct, I slowly lifted my head. Peering down at me over the top of the stall was a man. He was impossibly, unnaturally tall, his head nearly touching the ceiling. His face was a pale, gaunt mask under the harsh fluorescent lights, his eyes dark, hollow pits. Our gazes locked for a single, terrifying second, a second that contained an eternity of silent, malevolent appraisal. Then he was gone, retracted from view in an instant. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me. I kicked the door of the adjacent stall open, my flashlight held before me like a club. It was empty, completely empty, except for the shoes. They sat neatly in the center of the stall, side by side, as if their owner had simply dematerialized out of them. My breathing turned to ragged, panicked gasps. I scrambled out of the restroom, stumbling into the hallway, and then I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside in the biting cold, fumbling with the keys to the utility cart, my hand shaking too violently to find the ignition. "It's not real," I whispered into the fog of my own breath. "I'm just tired." The words were a hollow comfort against the stark, terrifying reality of what I had just witnessed. For days, the image was seared onto the inside of my eyelids. The gaunt face, the empty eyes, the impossible height. I dissected the memory, searching for a rational explanation. A trick of the light, a waking nightmare born of stress. But the shoes were an anchor of fact in a sea of terrifying implausibility. How could I explain the shoes? I rehearsed telling my manager, but the words sounded insane even in my own head. There was a giant ghost in the bathroom, and he left his footwear behind. I would be fired, not believed. So I choked on my secret. At home, I was a wreck. I was a stranger in my own life, patrolling the corners of my living room as if expecting an ambush. My son asked Maria why Daddy always looked so scared. Her worried gaze followed me everywhere. About a week later, my patrol route forced me past those restrooms again. The door was slightly ajar, moving gently in the draft. From within, I could have sworn I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I walked on, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin, pretending I had heard nothing at all. By the time the brutal winter began to recede, I was afraid, nerve-ending. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every echo was a footstep. The other guards started making jokes about my jumpiness. They had no idea. One blizzard-swept night, I sat in the cart by the main entrance, watching the snow swirl in the lights, and considered just walking in and quitting. But the image of the bills on our kitchen counter, of my son's trusting face, kept me chained to that seat. Quitting wasn't a choice I could make. I never saw the tall man again, not with the same horrifying clarity of that night in the restroom, but his presence lingered. Sometimes I'd catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure at the far end of an aisle, a form too tall, too thin to be human, only for it to vanish when I blinked. I continued to tell myself it was just my imagination, a symptom of my exhaustion. But in the deepest, most honest part of myself, I knew it wasn't. That spring, I finally went to management and asked for fewer night shifts, citing burnout. They agreed without much fuss. Overnight guards were a dime a dozen. Soon I was down to weekends, and by the time summer arrived, I had found another job and left MegaMart for good. I never gave Maria the full story, just a vague explanation that the job was destroying my health. The relief in her eyes was all the confirmation I needed. Our life slowly returned to normal, but a sliver of that winter's fear remained lodged in my soul. Even now, all these years later, if I drive by that store at night, I can't stop myself from glancing at its brightly lit facade. A part of me is always looking for him, for the impossibly tall figure I imagine standing just inside the glass, waiting. I'll never know for certain what I saw in that store. Was it a genuine haunting, or was it the profound and terrifying breakdown of a mind pushed beyond its limits by stress and exhaustion? In the end, I learned that it doesn't really matter. I learned that you cannot endlessly sacrifice your well-being on the altar of responsibility without something breaking. I thought I was showing strength by enduring it, by grinding myself down for my family. But true strength lies in recognizing your own breaking point. Some threats are far more real than ghosts. The threat of losing your family, of losing your sanity, of living a life where you pretend you are okay when you are anything but. The lesson wasn't about a ghost in a bathroom. It was about learning to take care of yourself before the shadows in your own mind grow too tall to overcome. In the spring of 2013, I was 68 years old and navigating the strange, untethered landscape of widowerhood. 2 years had passed since I'd lost Martha, and my world had shrunk to the four walls of our house, a space that now felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life once lived. My pension kept the bills paid, but it offered no defense against the crushing weight of empty hours. The silence in those rooms was an active presence, amplifying her absence until it was all I could hear. I needed a purpose, however small, a reason to put on a coat and step out into a world that had continued spinning without her. The faded "Help Wanted" sign in the window of the 24-hour laundromat on Grand River Avenue felt like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known how to voice. My new domain was a small formica-topped counter in a convenience nook, where I presided over an inventory of single-serve detergents and cheap snacks. My job was to make change and bear witness to the metronomic churn of washing machines and the low, rumbling sigh of industrial dryers. The atmosphere was a permanent haze of chemical lavender and the faint, metallic scent of hot water. Under the relentless glare of the fluorescent tubes, every surface seemed weary, every color slightly bleached out. I told myself this was a practical arrangement, a way to supplement my income. But the truth was, it was an escape from the ghosts in my house, a way to tether myself, however tenuously, to the ongoing current of life. The clientele who drifted in during the late hours were a quiet constellation of the city's night owls. There was a woman I privately called the Watcher, who arrived like clockwork at 2 a.m., took the same plastic chair, and stared, unblinking, into the swirling vortex of her laundry for a solid hour. A young, perpetually exhausted father would bring his 2 small children in afters. or their mother's shift ended, and I'd observe the quiet, tender ritual of them folding warm clothes together, a small pocket of family life blooming in a sterile public space. There was one regular, however, whose presence was a dissonant chord in the laundromat's quiet rhythm. He was a man in his 40s, built like a fire hydrant, with arms that were a chaotic scrawl of faded homemade tattoos. He favored sleeveless shirts that did little to conceal the simmering anger he seemed to carry in his shoulders. He appeared once a week, never speaking, his entrance announced by the violent clatter of quarters he'd slam into the change machine. His stillness was heavy and coiled, and his presence alone felt like a drop in barometric pressure, the kind that precedes a storm. Most nights were a forgettable blur of mundane transactions, but a Thursday in late April remains etched in my memory with perfect, painful clarity. The hour was approaching 11, and the laundromat was nearly deserted. The only sounds were the gentle thud of sneakers tumbling in a dryer and the distant whoosh of cars on the avenue. The man with the tattoos entered, his face set in a grim mask. This time he bypassed the change machine and strode directly to my counter. He slapped a crumpled $10 bill onto the Formica. The soft thud it made sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Give me a single," he commanded. I looked from the bill to his face, my mind slow to process the demand. "A single dollar, sir? This is a 10. He leaned forward, and the space between us became charged, electric. His eyes were flat and dark, like chips of obsidian. I said, "A single. Do it now." His voice was a low growl, stripped of all civility. A tremor started in my hands, a humiliating betrayal by my own body. I tried to keep my voice steady. I'm sorry, I can't. The cash register is locked for the night. You'll need to use the change machine over there." A cruel, mirthless smile twisted his lips. "Can't? Or won't?" Before I could formulate a response, his hand shot into the laundry bag slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a wet gray towel and in one swift, shockingly intimate motion, shoved it into my face. My senses were overwhelmed. The cold, damp fabric smothered me, and the sour, mildewed scent of neglected laundry filled my lungs. I staggered back, gasping, my mind reeling from the sheer unexpectedness of the assault. His face was just inches from mine, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant, malicious light. "Maybe that'll clear your head, old man." I stood there, paralyzed by a humiliation so profound it felt like a physical blow. He let out a short, barking laugh that echoed in the empty room. "Yeah, that's what I figured." He spun on his heel and strode out, leaving the $10 bill on the counter like a final insult. The automatic door hissed shut, leaving me in a silence that was suddenly deafening. My face burned. In my hand, I was still clutching the foul, dripping towel. My only coworker, a teenager tasked with mopping the floors, had witnessed the entire exchange. He offered a single, dismissive snort before returning to his work. "Dude, people are wild," he commented, his voice laced with the detached amusement of a spectator at a particularly strange show. In his eyes, I saw my own debasement reflected back as entertainment. The police were never an option. What would the report even say? Assault with a damp cloth? A man had used a piece of laundry to steal my dignity. There was no crime code for that. That night, the walk back to my apartment felt longer than usual. The rooms, once just quiet, now felt suffocating. For days, I couldn't wash the smell of that towel from my memory. I forced myself to go back. I reasoned with myself that it was an isolated incident, a random encounter with one of the city's broken people. But the laundromat was no longer a sanctuary. The chime of the front door, once a welcome distraction, now sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Every customer became a potential threat, every gruff voice a prelude to another confrontation. My chest was in a constant state of tightness. The memory played on a loop. His cold eyes, the shove, the smell. By the end of the week, I was a frayed nerve. On Friday, I found the owner and told him the job wasn't for me anymore. He accepted my resignation with an indifferent shrug, not even bothering to ask for a reason. I placed my keys and the plastic name tag on his desk. They felt impossibly heavy. Walking out into the cool evening air, a profound sense of relief washed over me. I didn't have to go back. But freedom from the place did not mean freedom from the event. Back in the solitude of my home, I was jumpy, flinching at the sound of a car door slamming outside. I tried to explain it to my son over the phone, but the words felt inadequate. "Dad, the world is full of jerks," he said, his tone kind but dismissive. "You can't let one guy get to you." He couldn't understand. It wasn't about the one man. It was about the sudden, violent tearing of the veil of safety I had unconsciously worn my entire life. It was the knowledge that at any moment, for no reason at all, your humanity could be rendered invisible to someone else. Years have passed, and I never saw that man again. He likely dissolved back into the city's anonymous churn, a ghost who probably doesn't even remember the encounter. But I remember. I carry the lesson of that night with me still. It's not his face or his voice that haunts me, but the visceral understanding that cruelty doesn't need a grand stage. A small, random act can burrow deep into your psyche and change the way you move through the world. I'll never know what would have happened if I had fought back, if I had screamed, if I had refused to be made small. All I know is that I walked away from that job and found other, quieter ways to fill the hours. But a part of me remains hyper-vigilant. I still feel a prickle of anxiety when a stranger stands too close in line. Violation doesn't always arrive with the glint of a knife or the threat of a gun. Sometimes it comes wrapped in a wet towel, and its only purpose is to remind you of your own fragility. The true beginning of this story was not that sun-drenched Tuesday in Portugal, but 2 years prior, in the profound silence that followed two significant farewells. The first was to my 40-year career as a librarian, a role that had defined me. The second, and far more devastating, was to my husband of 45 years. The convergence of these endings left me unmoored, a ship without a harbor. My days in retirement fell into a predictable, placid rhythm of gardening and reading. Yet the quiet in my house had developed a physical weight, and the walls of my familiar home began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully appointed prison. Well-meaning friends would gently suggest travel, a final pilgrimage to the places my husband and I had always dreamed of visiting together. And so, at 63, I booked a flight, not in search of grand adventure, but in a quiet pursuit of solace, a quest for enough light and color to begin filling the vast, empty spaces he had left behind. I chose Cascais, a coastal jewel near Lisbon, where the buildings were whitewashed to a brilliant gleam, and the cobblestone streets carried the mingled scents of sea salt and blooming jasmine. My time there was a gentle meditation, composed of long, aimless walks along the coast and tranquil afternoons spent in small cafes, where the ritual of coffee and sketching the fishing boats in the harbor became my new liturgy. The town itself was a soothing presence, its pace unhurried and its beauty disarming. My grasp of the Portuguese language was a clumsy patchwork of phrases gleaned from a guidebook, but I operated under the assumption that a genuine desire to connect would transcend any linguistic barrier. The warmth of the local people seemed to prove me right. A baker named Anna would greet me each morning with a smile and an extra pastry. An old fisherman with eyes the color of the sea would raise a hand in greeting as I passed his boat. In every small act of generosity, I saw a reflection of my late husband's spirit. I held a deep, unwavering faith in the inherent goodness of people, and Cascais felt like a living monument to that conviction. To extend my stay and allow for further exploration, I decided to take on a few hours of work each day at a small souvenir shop. It was simple, pleasant work, arranging ceramic roosters, dusting postcard racks, and selling the brightly painted tiles so characteristic of the region. The job provided a gentle structure to my days and a renewed sense of utility. The owner, a warm, bustling woman named Sophia, reminded me so much of my own sister, chattering away in a charming blend of Portuguese and halting English, her hands a constant, expressive flurry. She made me feel not like a tourist, but like a part of the town's fabric. My life had found a new, peaceful equilibrium. It never occurred to me that the most profound dangers are often found not in dark alleys, but in the most serene and sunlit of places. A particular park bench overlooking the azure expanse of the ocean became my personal haven. That Tuesday was, by all measures, a perfect day. The sky was an unbroken canvas of cerulean blue, and a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of the sea, tempered the sun's warmth. My shift at the shop concluded around noon, and I told Sophia I was off to find a quiet spot to sketch the old lighthouse. I recall a fleeting moment of indecision, a brief thought of leaving my small leather purse, containing my wallet and passport, in the presumed safety of the shop's back room. I dismissed it. I needed my sketchbook, my favorite fountain pen, and the few euros I'd set aside for a coffee. I made my way down to the promenade, the beautiful winding coastal path, and found an unoccupied bench at the far end, away from the gentle hum of the midday crowds. I settled in, opened my sketchbook, and began to lose myself in the intricate geometry of the cobblestones at my feet. It was then that a shadow fell across my page. They materialized, as if from the sunlight itself. A teenage boy and girl, their faces illuminated by bright, disarming smiles. The girl's arm was encased in a pristine white cast, a stark contrast against her sun-kissed skin. They addressed me in tentative English. "Excuse me, we are so sorry to bother you," the boy began, gesturing toward the girl's arm with an apologetic air. My heart, conditioned by a lifetime of empathy, immediately went out to them. They seemed so young, so utterly harmless. "We want to sign her cast," he explained, "but we do not have a pen." The request was so simple, so human, a direct appeal to the compassionate instinct I had always trusted. For a moment, my mind fumbled, trying to assemble the correct Portuguese words in response. Caution was not my first impulse. Helpfulness was. It was a role I had played my entire life. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice full of warmth. I carefully placed my sketchbook and my purse on the bench beside me and began to search through my larger travel bag for my pen. My entire focus was on this small act of kindness. As I searched, the girl with the cast smiled, her eyes wide with what seemed like genuine delight, and pointed out past my shoulder toward the sea. "Look, the dolphins!" she exclaimed. "They are playing." Instinctively I turned, my gaze sweeping across the sparkling water, half expecting to be rewarded with the sight of a graceful arcing fin. There was nothing but the vast, empty blue and the rhythmic sigh of the waves. The entire motion took no more than a second. When I turned back, they were gone. The space they had occupied was now just empty air, and my purse, which had been sitting securely on the bench right beside me, had vanished with them. I remained on the bench, motionless, a cold stillness spreading through my limbs. My mind was a frantic projector, replaying the scene in a torturous, silent loop. The guileless smiles, the simple plea for a pen, the one brilliantly executed moment of misdirection. Then came the sickening, tidal wave of comprehension. It was never about the money or the passport. The true injury was the crushing weight of my own foolishness. I had not been robbed by force. I had been dismantled by my own trusting nature. I had been an active, willing participant in my own violation. By the time I stumbled back to the souvenir shop, my face must have been a ghostly white, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Sophia enfolded me in a tight embrace as I recounted the story, her eyes full of a deep, familiar sorrow. "It is a trick they use," she explained softly, her voice heavy with resignation. "They seem like children, but they have no heart." In that moment, I understood the naivety of my own perspective. I had embraced the picturesque surface of the town while remaining blind to the quiet desperation that flowed beneath. I was not just a visitor experiencing her culture, I was a target. My trip ended there. I couldn't bring myself to stay, to walk past that bench and be haunted by the ghost of my own gullibility. I booked the first available flight home. The memory I carried back with me was not one of fear, but of a profound and searing shame. The material loss was an inconvenience. The loss of my faith in the fundamental goodness of strangers felt like a mortal wound. Back home, my friends offered their sympathies, reassuring me that I was merely the victim of a crime. But they couldn't grasp the heart of it. I had opened myself to the world in good faith, and the world had exploited that opening, not with violence, but with a smile. Years later, that afternoon in Cascais remains a vivid, painful memory. I can still feel the sun on my skin and the icy shame in my heart. The experience did not erase the genuine kindness I also found in Portugal, but it served as a brutal lesson in the world's complexities. It taught me that beauty and peril often inhabit the very same space, and that some thefts take not what is in your purse, but what is in your soul. I have not traveled abroad since. I still find solace in my books and my garden, but a subtle change has taken root in me. I no longer offer my smile so freely to every stranger. There is a new voice of caution inside me now, a quiet tightening in my chest that I have learned to listen to. For I now understand that a little bit of cynicism is not a weakness. Sometimes, it is the only armor that stands between a beautiful, ordinary day and a lesson you will carry for the rest of your life. Looking back to 2017, I often trace the fault lines of my life back to a single, seemingly innocuous decision: taking a job at Walmart. It's a strange quirk of fate how the choices we make out of simple necessity, the ones meant to be temporary detours, can carve the deepest channels in our memory. At 22, I was the ghost of a promising art student. The collegiate world, with its relentless critiques, its suffocating social hierarchies, and its unspoken demand to be a certain kind of artist, had become an anvil on my chest. So, I walked away. I packed my former life into the trunk of my car and drove until the faces on the street were all strangers. The position of overnight baker at the Walmart Supercenter was, for me, a sanctuary. It was a job that promised and delivered absolute isolation. The bakery was its own sovereign nation within the larger empire of the store, a self-contained world of stainless steel, industrial mixers, and the perpetually comforting aroma of baking bread. It had its own entrance, its own rhythm, and its own profound silence. People find it strange when I say I loved that job, but the methodical, repetitive nature of the work was a balm to my frayed nerves. The nightly ritual of kneading dough, of shaping loaves, of watching the silent, mechanical procession of bread through the proofer and into the ovens was a form of meditation. In that quiet solitude, with my headphones creating a world of sound only I could hear, I could finally breathe. My only human contact was a brief, perfunctory exchange with my supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Maria who arrived as the first hints of dawn were breaking. The rest of the long night was mine alone, and I craved that aloneness. It was a shield against the small talk and forced pleasantries I found so draining. It gave me the space to sift through the wreckage of my old ambitions, to wonder where the path had diverged. In those quiet hours, I still allowed myself to be an artist. I kept a small sketchbook with me, and I would fill its pages with charcoal studies of the machinery, finding a strange, stark beauty in the geometry of the cooling racks and the monolithic presence of the ovens. But one night in the early summer, the nature of my solitude was irrevocably altered. The comfort it offered curdled into a primal, suffocating dread. I was wiping down a steel prep table just after midnight, lost in a playlist of quiet, ambient music, when my eye caught something on the tabletop. It was a faint, almost ethereal symbol, traced in a dusting of flour. My first thought was that it was an illusion, a trick of the light on the metallic surface, perhaps a leftover mark from the day shift. But then I saw another one, a small, intricate geometric shape, etched with impossible precision into the condensation on an oven door. I stopped, my hand frozen in midair. I pulled one earbud out, and the familiar, gentle hum of the bakery was suddenly replaced by the frantic, percussive beat of my own heart. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that no one else was supposed to be in there. The bakery was locked and sealed after closing. A logical explanation eluded me. A prank from a janitor? But the symbols felt too deliberate, too esoteric to be a simple joke. A knot of cold fear began to tighten in my gut. I took a slow, steadying breath and began a systematic search of the space, my plastic dough scraper held tight in my hand like a pathetic weapon. And I found them everywhere. On the tiled floor, on the side of a wheeled rack of proofing dough, on the glass of the display cases. They were not random scribbles. They were a language, an interconnected pattern that seemed to spread through the bakery like a strange, silent fungus. My mind raced, desperately trying to anchor itself to a rational explanation. But the truth was undeniable. I was not alone. I don't know how long I stood there, my back pressed against the cold steel of a mixer, my breathing shallow and fast. A primal instinct screamed at me to flee, to burst through the doors and not stop running until I hit the safety of the all-night fluorescent glare of the main store. But a stronger, more terrifying curiosity held me rooted to the spot. I began to document what I was seeing, taking shaky photos with my phone. And that's when I found the last one. It was near the rear delivery door, a large, complex symbol drawn not in flour or condensation, but in a dark, viscous liquid that was still tacky to the touch. The design was a labyrinth of winding, intersecting lines, and in its very center was an object that shattered my fragile grip on reality. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, a page torn from my own sketchbook. On it was a charcoal self-portrait I had drawn weeks ago. The blood in my veins turned to ice. My throat constricted. This was not a random prank. This was personal. This was impossible. How could anyone have gotten this? How could they know who I was? A soft, scraping sound from the walk-in storage pantry jolted me back to the present. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner in my chest. Instead of running, I found myself moving toward the sound, my body acting on some horrific autopilot setting. I raised the dough scraper, my knuckles white. The pantry door swung open slowly, and a man stepped out. He was not menacing or imposing. He was thin, dressed in dark work clothes, and his eyes, when they met mine, were not filled with malice, but with a deep, unnerving sadness. He held a small piece of charcoal in his fingers. He looked at me, then at the drawing on the floor, and then back at me. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost melodic, yet it cut through the silence of the bakery like a shard of glass. "They told you how it would mean something," he said, his gaze unwavering. "They told you that your art would leave a mark on the world, a permanent one." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. How could this stranger know the very words of my professors, the secret hopes I had harbored, the precise nature of the failure that had driven me here? "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. He offered a sad, small smile and held up the piece of charcoal. "We all try to leave our mark," he said softly, "but most marks are temporary." He gestured around the bakery, at the symbols that adorned the equipment, at the one at his feet. "These will be wiped away in the morning." He didn't make a move toward me. He didn't threaten me. He simply turned and walked to the rear delivery door, the one that should have been locked from the inside, opened it, and slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness. He was gone. The police came, filed a report, and noted the lack of forced entry. They saw a bizarre act of trespassing, a strange but ultimately harmless prank. My supervisor, Maria, saw a mess that needed to be cleaned up before the morning shift arrived. They couldn't see what I saw. They couldn't feel the chilling intimacy of the intrusion, the way his words had targeted the most vulnerable hidden parts of my soul. I worked 2 more nights in that bakery. The solitude I had once cherished had become a terrifying, sentient thing. Every hum of the machinery, every shadow cast by the ovens felt like a prelude to his return. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. I couldn't stay. I quit without giving a real reason. Years have passed. I've built a different, quieter life for myself, far from the world of art and the sterile isolation of that bakery. But the man's words and the mystery of his visit have never left me. He wasn't a monster or a madman. He was something far more terrifying. A mirror. A quiet, sad reflection of my own abandoned dreams. Some nights, when the house is still and I am truly alone, I still think of him, and I am haunted by the one question I can never answer. Was our encounter a random, inexplicable collision of two broken people, or had he been looking for me all along?